Mrs. Natalie Elphick was suspended from the House of Commons for seeking to influence a judge presiding over the case of her husband, the then MP for Dover. He was standing trial for rape and sexual assault. She blamed the women, saying that her attractive spouse was always getting too much attention from young women like the victims of her husband's sex-crazed crimes. She was admitted to the ranks of the Parliamentary Labour Party today. Mrs. Natalie Elphick blamed the firefighters for the deaths of 3 people in her constituency and demanded that they be stripped of their right to strike. Mrs. Natalie Elphick, Labour Member of Parliament, is fond of standing on the beaches and screaming abuse at the desperate people who've made it across the English Channel. Today, she's a Labour Member of Parliament. Not like Jeremy Corbyn. He's not good enough for the Labour Party, even though he led it in 2017 to its greatest electoral performance since 1945, when Keir Starmer was in his shadow cabinet and describing him as his friend. Mrs. Elphick is a Labour MP, but Diane Abbott is not. She remains suspended 1 year on, pending investigation of a letter that she wrote to a national newspaper, namely The Observer. In the letter, she said something that almost everyone would agree was an obvious statement of truth. But 12 months later, she remains suspended. So there's no room at the inn for Diane Abbott, who entered Parliament on the same day as me, nearly 40 years ago. There's no room for Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party. But a woman who could quite comfortably have fitted in under the flag of the British National Party, a far-right conservative, crossed the floor to almost universal aplomb in the House of Commons today. If ever there was evidence supplied that the Uni Party is one, that so little distance is there, not even a narrow tributary, never mind a political river, no red water, no blue water between, the 2 cheeks of the same backside, this was the evidence. There's no room for socialists in the Labour Party, but neo-fascists can apply. Mrs. Elphick is one. She is now sitting behind the presumed next Prime Minister of Great Britain. It is a shameful day, a day which in normal times would see Keir Starmer's portrait turned to face the wall. But it will not be. The Labour Party is dead. It is a dead parrot. It is an ex-parrot. And those who remain in it, those Labour MPs, councillors, activists, office bearers, members, are really now beyond hope. There can be no redemption for them. And so I am bound to announce that we will not take any more defections from the Labour Party after the end of this month. We're giving people to the end of this month to leave the genocidal Labour Party of Keir Starmer and Natalie Elphick. Put the note in your diary now. The end of May is the end of us taking people who are prepared to, even at this 11th hour, defect and dissociate themselves from the genocide. Much more importantly, a Palestinian woman wrote today that the day before she saw her son dancing joyously in the ravaged streets of Rafah. Dancing because the news had broken on Radio Monte Carlo in Arabic that the Palestinian resistance had accepted the ceasefire terms which the whole world was demanding that they accept. The children thought that the days and nights of endless torture, murder, of the blood running freely in the filthy, sewage-strewn streets of Rafah would soon be over. Imagine that woman's grief as she buried that same little boy in the foul earth of contaminated Gaza today. The pictures of children crushed under breeze block have touched many millions of people around the world. For some, it's no longer possible to look at the suffering, the misery, the death, the destruction, the famine, the disease that is rampant in a cage, a concentration camp of 2.3 million people, 1.6 million of them now trapped in the tent city of Rafah alongside the Egyptian frontier. Israel didn't just reject the ceasefire that the Palestinians accepted. It doubled down. It crossed all the red lines that all the Western leaders had tried to lead us to believe they had drawn. If the Israeli army invades Rafah, they said, it would be impossible to avoid committing serious crimes against humanity. It would thereby inevitably lead to the issuing of warrants for the arrest of Israeli leaders. It would make it implicitly impossible for Western countries to continue to supply the weapons, the money, the material, and the diplomatic and political cover which has facilitated, enabled, collaborated with 7 months of genocidal violence. In the House of Commons yesterday, I spoke again about this matter. The Zionist lobby was out in force, particularly in the rancid form of one Suella Braverman. It was the first time I had watched her up close and personal. She's not as nice as she looks, and she looks exactly what she is, pure, unadulterated evil. I'm saying this here now in the building. I could not say it in the chamber. There I have to pretend that she is a right honourable lady. But in fact, she came to the House yesterday to demand that Netanyahu be backed by the British government to finish the job. By finish the job, she meant the crushing underfoot, under blocks, under bricks, under fire of little children and women. She talked about the Israeli hostages and demanded proof of life of those hostages. Actually, Israel has killed a very significant number of those hostages. At this rate, there may be no live hostages left to exchange with the much larger number, exponentially larger number of Palestinian hostages held without trial in Israeli dungeons. Braverman demanded that the hostages be freed and that proof of life be provided. I countered that there was no proof of life of the 66,000 children, hostages in the tent city of Rafah. Uncountable numbers of those children and their mothers are now either murdered, maimed, or living in terror of being murdered and maimed. These children and their mothers and their fathers, brothers and sisters are every bit as much a hostage as any Israeli prisoner taken on the 7th of October. The difference is the Palestinians, for their own reasons, perhaps, are desperately trying to keep them alive. The child hostages in Rafah are, on the other hand, the subject of remorseless and desperate attacks by the Israeli government to kill them. Kill a large number of them they already have, and they will not stop killing until they are stopped. As I said in the show on Sunday, Israel is the worst serial killer in history. They have killed more women and children than every murderer, every mass murderer of whom you have ever heard. All the documentaries you've ever watched on Netflix about these mass killers pale into insignificance compared to Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and the rest of his murderous cutthroat gang. But the problem is, those watching this show have almost certainly seen the images to which I am referring. The mass of the population, unfortunately, have seen none of them. The mass of the population don't know that while there's 123 or so Israeli hostages, that there are some 10,000 Palestinian hostages, including people that were freed during the last exchange of hostages, only promptly to be dragged back behind bars. These Palestinian hostages have never been tried. Insofar as they are ever tried, they are tried under the mandate laws left by the British Mandate in 1948. They are tried in front of military judges in military courts, but most of them are never tried at all. The people who know about those who died, were killed on October the 7th, most of the people that are not watching this show have no idea that something like now 150,000 Palestinians have been killed, mutilated, maimed, wounded, with no hospitals to look after them, or are still missing under the rubble. 150,000 out of a population of 2.3 million. Most people don't know that the people of Gaza literally have nowhere to go. They are trapped on all sides. Even walking into the sea would bring about their demise by the guns of the Israeli Navy lying just offshore. This is not shooting fish in a barrel. This is murdering children in a barrel. It's murdering women in a barrel. This is a slaughter, an annihilation, an attempt to literally annihilate, to extirpate, to completely wipe out an entire genus of people, hence the crime of genocide. This is an attempt to clear the land, no more, no less. It's not about religion. It's not about people claiming to feel unsafe on the campus of the London School of Economics or the School of Oriental and African Studies or in Columbia or Yale or Harvard or UCLA. This is not about anti-Semitism. This is about an attempt by a terrorist state literally to clear a piece of land of its inhabitants, either by driving them out into the Sinai desert in some biblical exodus, which is why Israel has now taken control of the Egyptian frontier itself in total violation of the Camp David Accords of 1979, an act of war against the quisling regime of General Sisi in Egypt, although he has said nothing so far about this act of war, about this breach of Egypt's sovereignty. Egypt, the beating heart of the Arab world, 120 million people, whose gallant army in 1973 liberated the Suez Canal, liberated the Sinai, drove the Israelis out of their land, is now being utterly humiliated by Netanyahu. This poses a problem for President Biden because both Israel and Egypt are his close friends. Both Israel and Egypt are dumps for untold billions of American taxpayers' money. And now one is committing acts of war against the other. It is a sorry mess, but even worse is the mess in Western parliaments, governments, chanceries, presidential palaces, prime ministers' residences. These Western politicians appear not to know what to do. They all drew a red line. The red line has now been crossed. They cannot bring themselves. In the case of the British, I tried to intervene on the Prime Minister today. I was not successful in being called. If I had been, I was going to ask him why he ordered our brave pilots flying out of Akrotiri in our sovereign base in somebody else's Cyprus to fly spy missions, 200 spy missions over the Gaza Strip in fortification of Netanyahu's genocidal assault. I was not able to ask the question, but I can tell you already what his answer would have been. It would have been that we never comment on the movements of our military forces, which isn't actually true, but would have sufficed as an attempt to palm off that question. We are flying spy flights over Gaza, 200 of them, to facilitate the crushing and shredding, the murdering and mutilating of little children and women. And the British Parliament is not even entitled to an answer to the question, why? He said today that the amount of arms being exported from Britain to Israel was minuscule. Well, minuscule or not, those arms are killing children and women. But that's only minuscule if you define it as a completed weapon. The truth is, materiel from here in Britain is in almost all Israeli munitions. Parts of Israeli weapons are exported from here on an almost daily basis. And so, having authored the entire Palestinian disaster in this building, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when on behalf of one people, our government promised to a second people the land that belonged to a third people, sending us, in Churchill's words, down that dreadful, blood-stained staircase to where we are now in 2024, we're still at it. Britain is still killing Palestinians. Well, on this day in 1945, in the next hours, in Moscow, they will be celebrating mightily Victory Day. It won't be marked here. In fact, it was marked here in Britain today by the Home Secretary announcing a new raft of punishments and sanctions on Russia, on the basis that the last raft did so well, succeeded so almost completely, that Russia is booming while Britain and the West is sinking, that the Russian economy is powering ahead as ours falters and dies. We won't mention Victory Day because we don't want to remember the glorious wartime alliance of the USA, Great Britain, China, and the USSR. We can't mention it, even though on this day, the Beast of Berlin was crushed in his lair by the victorious Red Army, with the British and American armies on the Elbe. We can't mention it because now we have to love Germany and hate Russia. We have to love Japan and hate China. That's the moral and political bankruptcy of Western governments, I hope summed up well in a 20-minute monologue. Stay tuned for Scott Ritter, the world's leading analyst of war and the politics of war. Stay tuned.